CGC just screwed us all because they just graded a giant size X-Men #1 at a 9.9 for the first time ever, which means one of two things. Either they just so happen to get the nicest copy of giant size X-Men #1 that they have ever received out of over 13,000 that have been submitted, or they have made the conscious decision to lower the standards for their grading. And though there's no way for me to know for sure, I strongly suspect that it's the second case, because they've been hinting for months that they were going to start lowering their standards when they announced what would have been unfathomable even a year ago, that they were now considering a 9.9 pre-screen. Plus, if you go look at the publicly available images of this giant size X-Men 9.9, you would see it's a nice book, but there's nothing that special about it. In fact, it has some very obvious color rub. And so I don't think there's any way that an unbiased person, and again, this is just speculation, but I don't think anyone would look at that book and say, oh, this one, this copy is the chosen one. Plus, if you're just thinking of probability, once again, what are the odds that this giant size X-Men #1 is the chosen one? Now, if I'm right, why in the world would CGC be lowering their standards? And I think there are many possibilities to consider, but I want to share 3 reasons that I think that they might be doing this. Number 1, I think that they have learned from Harvard and many other elite universities the power of grade inflation, which is defined as the awarding of higher grades over time for the same quality of work, which devalues those grades, because if everybody's making A's, then of course A's stop being so special, but which keep customers happy. In other words, Harvard has realized that people don't want to spend $50,000 to get B's and C's. And so if they're going to keep their customers happy, they need to start giving out A's. In fact, studies have shown that in 2011, they gave out 60% of their grades as A's, which is pretty high, really. I mean, if 60% of your grades are A's, are they really special? But even worse, 10 years later, all of a sudden, 79% of the grades that they give out are now A's. Other studies have shown that since the 1960s, universities have increased the grades they give out by an average of 0.15 GPA every 10 years. Now, again, it makes those grades less valuable, but the universities realize it's what keeps bringing students in, what keeps bringing those monies in. And so what in the world does that have to do with the CGC? Well, I think CGC has realized, well, what's going to keep the customers happy is giving out higher grades. You know, customers keep coming back if they're getting 9.8s, and certainly if they're getting 9.9s, a lot more than if they're getting 9.6s and 9.4s. Now, of course, you might be wondering, hey, isn't that going to make some people like me angry when all of a sudden their 9.8s stop being so special, stop being so valuable, because all of a sudden the market is now flooded with 9.9s? Well, yes, it is going to make us very angry, but CGC, I think, understands the same thing that Harvard does, is that people pay for the name and they keep coming back. So in other words, no matter how bad Harvard education gets, anytime in the foreseeable future at least, people are still going to be lining up to go there because they know once they start filling out a job resume that if they can put Harvard, well, all of a sudden that means they're going to be making more money. Now, in the same way, when comic dealers start looking at the books they're going to sell, they know that when they list those books on eBay or Instagram or wherever they're selling, that if that label says CGC, then they're going to make more money. And so they're going to just continue to submit over and over and over, even if the quality goes down, just because the brand means so much. And obviously that's frustrating, but what the heck are you going to do? Now, another thing to consider is that if CGC is taking their lessons from Harvard and learning the power of grade inflation, what does this mean 10 years from now? Well, what it would mean is that all of a sudden we're going to start seeing 10.0 pre-screens. All of a sudden, books that were a 6.0 are start going to be a 6.5. Does that happen? I don't know, but I think it's a real concern to be thinking about right now. Now, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, of course, I'd appreciate it if you consider doing so now. Now, the second reason that I believe CGC is lowering their standards is because they stand to make a boatload of money from resubmissions. In other words, the most recent copy of Giant Size X-Men #1 that sold at a 9.8 went for $22,200. A lot of money, don't get me wrong. And nobody knows what this 9.9, of course, is going to go for. And so people are speculating, but the average, I would say, that I've heard that people think is that this book is going to go for about $500,000. Now, if you're sitting at home with a copy of a Giant Size X-Men #1, 9.8, and you're looking at it and you say, hey man, this looks as good as that 9.9's pictures that I see online. And if I can send it in and it gets that grade bump, all of a sudden it goes from a $20,000 book to a $500,000 book. And of course, once the market gets flooded with more 9.9s, it's not going to stay at 500,000, but let's just say it settles at 100,000. You say, hey, I can turn this $20,000 book into a $100,000 book. And all I've got to do to risk that is to send this book to CGC and let them pre-screen it, because I'm sure CGC is going to develop some program where they guarantee it'll come back at least a 9.8. I mean, if you're risking your 9.8 dropping to a 9.6, you're going to be a lot more hesitant. But CGC will, I'm certain, come up with something where they're like, hey, you'll at least get a 9.8, but you might get that 9.9. Well, all of a sudden, again, everybody with those 9.8s are going to say, I stand to make tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars if this comes back at a 9.9. And I just need to risk, let's say $100 for that to happen. Well, woo, baby, let's send this thing in. And so CGC is going to make tons, I tell you, of money on these resubmissions. And the third reason why I believe that CGC may be lowering their standards is because they stand to make another boatload of money from the higher fees that they will be able to charge at higher graded books, because they charge a percentage of the fair market value to grade high-end books. So in other words, if they grade a Giant Size X-Men #1 at a 9.8, they stand to earn $888, which is a lot of money, especially if they only put in the few minutes of work that they've been showing on some of their most recent videos. But if they all of a sudden grade that book at a 9.9 and it comes back at that $500,000 fair market value, which of course they've got to determine this before the book actually sells, but soon they'll have a sale, and let's say the fair market value, at least for a time, is $500,000, then all of a sudden they get $20,000. And so they are heavily incentivized to grade books at a higher number. Now, of course, they're risking people losing faith in their company, but maybe one day that happens. But again, I don't think it will anytime soon, because just like Harvard, they have that name. And so I think they're going to be laughing all the way to the bank. So obviously I'm angry, but what do you think? Am I just overreacting? Am I just being too sensitive and this isn't really a big deal? Or are you angry just like me? Also, now I have to decide what to do with all my CGC 9.8s. Are these things going to be really devalued a year from now when all of a sudden the market is flooded with 9.9s theoretically? And if so, do I need to start putting all of these on the market? Now, I'm not as concerned with my mid-grade Silver Age books because there's not as much difference between a 6.5 and a 7.0 as there is between a 9.8 and a 9.9 in terms of fair market value. But even those, is CGC going to start lowering their standards for mid-grade books as well? And if so, it will devalue my books. So what do I do? What are you going to do? Now, once again, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, I'd appreciate it if you consider doing so now. Like, comment, thank you.